Well, it's an honor to be here, and particularly in front of a painting that whenever I was brought here on school holidays, I absolutely loved, and that was Bailed Up. It is, I realize now, an extraordinary mirror of its times. It was painted in the 1890s, but it is an extraordinary mirror of what Eric Hobsbawm called, and George Roudet called, the social bandit. The man who, I mean, it doesn't look like a car hijacking, does it? It doesn't look as if those men are sociopaths. If you look at the angle of the woman having a chat to the man in the door, even John Dunmore Lang, the founder of Presbyterianism in Australia, was held up by the Clark boys, sons of convicts, ultimately hanged in Sydney. And he said that he found them very interesting young men, and he understood why they were in the position that they were. Those men are not in a hurry. They're not saying, let's grab the loot and get out. And the reason they're not in a hurry, probably two. First of all, if a bushranger knew his trade, as Ben Hall and Ned Kelly did, if you abstract from the slaughter of the policemen at Stringy Bark Creek for a moment, the bushrangers who knew their trade always destroyed mortgage papers when they robbed a bank. Both Ned and Ben Hall, who are the sort of quintessence of bushrangery or social banditry, those youngish men don't think they're committing a crime. They think, perhaps in a primitive way, that they are in rebellion against an unjust police force and in rebellion against an unjust land system which reduces them and their parents to a small, impossible acreage, while the grandee, of course, occupies hundreds of thousands of acres. So they have, from destroying mortgages and from the people they know in those hills, they don't have to rush. They're not going to be dobbed in. No equivalent of some local farmer riding desperately to town to get the cops. That is not going to happen. The other thing that is interesting is that the police are unlikely to turn up because the bushranger always stole his horses. The policeman was always given a budget for horses. So it was a case of, with all due respect to car manufacturers, it was a case of Volkswagen Beetles chasing Lamborghinis. And they are the features of that picture that mean a lot to me. The man leaning over the mane, the man with his head on the side, the man talking at the door, all bespeak men at comfort with their environment, as the bushrangers were. They were like the Taliban. They might have been tutted at, but they knew the country. Anyhow, the issue of the social bandit, the man or woman who don't think they're criminals, is very interesting in Australian history, because there were many convicts who were not petty thieves or stock thieves for the pure sake of stealing stock, but in their own minds they were committing an adjustment of equity. They were poaching because of enclosure in England. They were destroying threshing machines and automatic mechanical looms. They were like the Spencean philanthropists, who were a Methodist sect who made the mistake of taking Christ's teachings on property seriously. Now, you can't get anywhere in society doing that. When Christ said anything about sex, he was exaggerating. He had to be obeyed exactly. But when he said anything about property, like go sell all you have and come follow me, or it is harder for a rich man to get to heaven than a camel through the eye of a needle, etc., then he was simply hyperbolic. He was exaggerating. So the Spencean philanthropists were anti-landlord, and they marched upon the Tower. They followed a man named the Reverend Spence, a Methodist preacher. They were passionately opposed to the enclosure of estates in England and to the forbidding of what was on those estates to the populace. And so they they believed in poaching as a political act. They said, why are we the only creatures who can't enter into a landlord's huge enclosure and take sustenance for our families? The fox can go, the crow can go, any animal of prey can go, and we are the only animals excluded, and yet we are God's children. There was a Spencean philanthropist transported who became the master of my wife's convict great-grandparents, actually. A man, his son became the master of my wife's great-grandparents. His name was Brodrib. And he, if you look at the map of Gippsland, you'll see there's a Brodrib River there. Both my wife's great-grandparents, Hugh Larkin and Mary Shields, were assigned to Brodrib down near Cooma. In England, you had the swing rioters, against whom Lord Sidmouth and Lord Castlereagh had to bring out the troops. The swing rioters were, again, in their own minds, protesters against land inequity. They did not see themselves as criminals. Must have been an awful thing to be on a convict ship, chained beside someone whom you considered a criminal, when you didn't consider yourself a criminal. You thought of yourself as having tried, again, to adjust the world to your survival, to the justice of the issue, the inherent natural justice that should reign in the world. So the swing rioters believed that the landlord should swing. And then, of course, there were the Chartists. There were the Canadians who arrived in 1838-39, both French-Canadian and Presbyterian, who rose up against the high Tory government of Upper and Lower Canada, and many of whom served time out in Canada Bay near Homebush in a camp known as Longbottom. They were rather literate and highly moral people, although one of them ran off with the wife of a highly literate pub keeper on Parramatta Road. But apart from occasional outbreaks of Gallic fervour, they were highly reputable convicts. They were ultimately all repatriated. They probably left their genes in New South Wales. God knows what fine blood runs in our veins. My wife's great-grandfather, Hugh Larkin, in 1833, received a sentence, was typical of these social bandits. He lived on a quarter-acre holding. He approached his landlord in East Galway in a place called Somerset House, and he broke down a back door. He was armed and he uttered threats. These were oath-bound societies. The society he belonged to that existed right throughout Ireland, like the swing rioters in England, were called the ribbon men. And they were an oath-bound society which went through three processes, just like the swing rioters. They would, first of all, make a demonstration. They would take an oath. They would make a demonstration in favor of land justice, of landlords treating them right. Then they would post a threatening notice, and it was written in terms that were later taken up in the Jerilderie letter of Ned Kelly and in many of the pronouncements of bushrangers. The bushrangers were all pups. The rhetoric of the bushrangers were pups out of Captain Swing rioters in England and ribbon men in Ireland. And the second part of the swing ribbon man protest was to post a threatening notice. The next stage, to knock on the landlord's door with a stolen weapon in your arms and threaten him. And the third stage was actually to fire shots. Well, no one who fired shots or assassinated a landlord or his agent got to Australia, because that was the death sentence. But Hugh Larkin was characteristic. He got a life sentence for appearing in arms and uttering threats to his landlord. In his mind, he would not have been a criminal. In the mind of the Crown, and arguably from their point of view, he would have been a common criminal like a Dublin pickpocket or a London pickpocket. But he did not see himself in those terms. This leads us to one of the myths of Australian history, that in Eastern Australia, convictism ended, thank God. We became, or convict transportation ended 1842, revived in 1848. They were sending trustees up to Queensland, or what became Queensland, up until 1848. It continued for some years more in Tasmania, and then it ended, and the gold rushes began, and all the convicts started breathing, stopped breathing, became silent, stopped having kids, had no further impact on Australian society. Well, I don't think that's the case. Ned Kelly is an example. His father was a pig thief from Ireland. Whether he was a social bandit or a tea leaf, we don't know. Ned Kelly's brother, Jim, who was in Wagga jail in 1880 at the time of the Kelly outbreak, Jim Kelly lived till 1942. And I knew his niece, and she said she took him to the opening of Woolworths in Benalla in Victoria in 1938. And she said he became so overwhelmed by the array of goods that he went down putting 5 bob on one counter and 5 bob on another, saying, I'll have half a dozen of those and a dozen of those. And she said to him, watch out, Uncle Jim, not everyone's honest like us. So there's the child of a convict who lived till 1942. Did he pass on any attitudes? Of course he did. My wife's great-grandmother died in the early 1850s, giving birth to a child who had the temerity to live till 1947. Was that child influenced by his convict father, given certain attitudes? Of course. And so it goes on. We find convicts living well into the 20th century. In Western Australia, where convictism was introduced, convict transportation was introduced just as it was ending here. It was introduced because the larger landholders needed cheap labour. A lot of those men, they were trustees from British prisons, and they were political prisoners of a group called the Fenians. One of my uncles, great uncles, was one of them. I don't know where I got my air of respectability from, but one of my great uncles was got 10 years. The Fenian movement in Ireland was a nationalist movement. It's interesting that they were amongst the first men, as far as we know, the first criminals ever mugshot. And it's wonderful to think that on that historic day, a Keneally was there on the wrong side of the camera. And those men, his contemporaries, lived a great and long life well into the 20th century. John Flood of Gympie, radical newspaper man, Labour newspaper man, he was one of those Western Australian convicts who spread his opinions through newspapers. And that was a good tradition in Australia because the Sydney Gazette was run by convicts into the 1930s. And so this idea of social banditry explains why there's a certain robustness still left in us. Not everyone was a pickpocket. A great number, for example, in Hugh Larkin's ship in 1838, over 70 men who were guilty of ribbon offences and who were, to use again Eric Hobsbawm's phrase, social bandits or primitive rebels. And here's the primitive rebels again reproduced by Roberts. I've only covered one of the myths I was going to talk about. The second myth was there was no war in the North, even though in Northern Australia, even though we had repeater Snider and Martini Henry rifles. There were terrible wars. There is records of them. There are people like Chief Constable Wiltshire, who wrote an entire memoir of his extermination and dispersal of Aboriginals in return for murders, the murder of Malays, the murder of miners at Pine Creek, and so on. It was a bitter war, but of course we had the repeater rifle. We could shoot faster than they could throw. They were fighting for their country. They were as flawed as anyone. The war, probably the seminal event of the war in the North, is when the founder of Aussie Rules, Tom Wills, accompanied his father into country west of Rockhampton in 1861. In the summer of 1861, all their drovers' wives, their drovers' children, and Horatio Wills, a very important squatter, were killed by Aboriginals. So women were killed, children were killed, and the retaliation was massive. In fact, one squatter who had a certain sympathy for the Aboriginals said, a man called Grundy actually, said that he'd never seen such a large punitive expedition put together. Constable Wiltshire's attitude was, and his account of massacres of Aboriginals, include such phrases as our carbines spoke English to the ancient majesty of those rocks. He said, we surrounded them with my native police. That's interesting, there were native police involved. Aboriginal police from down here along the Murray and along the Murray in Victoria and New South Wales. No fellow feeling at that stage for the Aboriginals of the North, given carbines, given licence. And it's a bit like the way the Scots were used against the Scots in the good old days. Aboriginal against Aboriginal, but led by white officers. So there's a massacre on the Gregory River in 1894, in which he says we surrounded them with our carbines and sic transit gloria mundi. So passes the glory of the earth. And he said after it was over, we took women and children. The children were generally distributed around stations. But one of the women was pregnant and went into, understandably, went into labour as a result of the battle that had just taken place. And he helped her give birth. And he said, I looked down and I saw on the ground beneath her legs a new stock killer. So it was a bitter war in the North altogether. May I, in the few minutes remaining, and I have 2 or 3 minutes, I'm generally 10 minutes over. I was injected with the same gramophone needle as Gough Whitlam. But Tom Roberts, first of all, he couldn't sell that painting, couldn't give it away. Well, he didn't want to give it away. Couldn't sell. The State Gallery bought this in 1931, and I think he died in 1930. He, interestingly, like many of the painters, Australian painters in this gallery, as an older Australian painting in Europe, became an orderly at Wandsworth Hospital in England during World War I. He was older. Most of the others orderlies ultimately became war artists. And one of them was Arthur Streeton, of course. And one of them was a man called G. Henry Fulwood, who also worked with Roberts as ordinary orderlies. No flash rank. I think Fulwood reached all the glory of a corporal. And Roberts worked in the maxillofacial section of Wandsworth Hospital. Now, the only time I've seen war wounds is in Eritrea, but the ones that shocked me most were the facial wounds, the wounds that took a face away, so that you just had steak, human steak, and maybe an eye in the middle of it. Horrifying wounds. And it was in the section where Tom Roberts was a painter, was an orderly rather, that faces were reconstructed by dental surgeons, men who'd had their face partially or almost totally taken off by shrapnel, by explosions. And in the history of the medical services of World War I, in 3 volumes, which is on the website of the Australian War Memorial, which a book I love, 3 volumes on the medical services in World War I. I love them because A, they're online, and B, I've got a book. Last year I wrote a book on the subject, a novel. But he did the drawings for that medical history in the maxillofacial area. He did a succession of drawings of how men's faces were remade. Those drawings are light years away from the sort of almost idyllic hold-up that's in progress there. It's great to be amongst these paintings because it's so easy to link them all up with the history of Australia. And for example, you can see up there why Lambert became a World War I official war artist. And it's harder to see in Will Dyson's paintings why he tried to get General Monash sacked. But that is another story, and we are out of time. Thank you so much for listening.